Years ago, I was diagnosed with a progressive neurological condition. At first, it was just some numbness in my legs. Then came the fatigue, the muscle weakness, and finally, the wheelchair. It wasn't easy, but I adapted. I learned to navigate this new life, determined to stay independent. That's how I ended up in this apartment complex. It was perfect. Ground floor unit, wide doorways, and most importantly, a designated handicapped parking spot right outside. I paid extra for that spot every month, and it was worth every penny. It meant I could get in and out of my car safely, without struggling across a busy parking lot. Everything was fine for the first few months. Then she showed up. I first noticed her car in my spot on a Tuesday afternoon. I'd just gotten back from a doctor's appointment, exhausted and in pain, only to find I couldn't park. I had to circle the lot 3 times before finding a spot far from my door. By the time I got inside, I was ready to collapse. I didn't want to make a fuss, so I left a polite note on her windshield. In the note, I explained that this was a reserved handicapped spot and kindly asked her to use the guest spots in the future. The next day, my spot was clear. Problem solved, I thought. A week later, it happened again, and again, and again. Each time I left a note, and each time she ignored it. I tried talking to the building manager, but he just shrugged and told me that if she wasn't there when they checked, they couldn't do anything. I called towing companies, but they all wanted me to foot the bill. On my fixed income, not a chance. After a month of this, I'd had enough. It was time to take matters into my own hands. That Friday, I saw her pull into my spot again. This time, instead of leaving a note, I waited. As soon as she left her car, I pulled up behind her, blocking her in completely. Then, I settled in to watch the show. From my balcony, I had a perfect view of the parking lot. I grabbed a book and a cup of tea, then sat back to wait. It didn't take long. About an hour later, she came storming out of the building. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but her wild gesticulations told me plenty. She paced around her car, then stood there with her hands on her hips, clearly waiting for someone to come move. I just kept reading my book. After about 20 minutes, she started looking around desperately. That's when she noticed the empty handicap spot, just 2 spaces down. The realization dawned on her face, quickly replaced by anger. She marched over to my door and started pounding. I ignored it. Back at her car, she tried to maneuver out of the spot, but there wasn't enough room. She even attempted to squeeze through the narrow gap between our cars, but her oversized SUV wouldn't fit. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Some of my neighbors who had seen this woman repeatedly steal my spot were explaining the situation to others. That's when she lost it. With a screech of tires, she slammed her car into reverse, ramming straight into mine. The crowd gasped. Someone shouted that they were calling the police. I calmly set down my book and made my way downstairs. By the time I got there, 2 police officers had arrived. The woman was ranting about how I had blocked her in, conveniently leaving out the part where she'd stolen my spot. I explained the situation calmly, showing them my parking permit and pointing out the many witnesses who could back up my story. The officers weren't impressed with her behavior. Neither was the building manager, who finally showed up. In the end, she was charged with destruction of property and banned from the premises. Her insurance had to pay for the damage to my car, which honestly wasn't a big deal. I'd been saving up for a new, more accessible vehicle anyway. From that day on, my parking spot remained blissfully empty whenever I needed it. Life might have slowed me down, but it sure hasn't stopped me. For as long as I can remember, I've struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder, the nightmares, the constant fear, the overwhelming anxiety. It was all too much for a kid to handle. My parents tried everything to help me, but nothing seemed to work until we discovered the magic of service dogs. That's how I met my furry guardian angel. He wasn't just a pet, he was my lifeline. With him by my side, I finally felt safe. He could sense when I was about to have a panic attack and would nudge me, grounding me back to reality. He even helped me stop hurting myself during particularly rough episodes. When it was time for me to start 6th grade, I was nervous but excited. I thought having my service dog with me would make the transition easier. I called the school to let them know about my service dog. I figured it was just a formality, you know? But the response I got left me stunned. The school secretary told me they couldn't allow dogs in the school because it was against their policy. I tried to explain that he wasn't just a dog, but a service dog that I needed for my PTSD. The secretary just repeated that rules were rules and there would be no exceptions. I tried explaining that it was illegal to deny access to service animals, but they wouldn't budge. My parents considered fighting it but decided it might be easier if I just tried going without him for a while. They didn't want to make waves at my new school, so I went to school alone. It was hard, really hard. I felt vulnerable and scared all the time, but that was just the beginning. The bullying started almost immediately. Kids can be cruel, but I never expected the teachers to join in. They'd make snide comments when they thought I couldn't hear. I overheard one teacher asking another if they could believe I had tried to bring a dog to school. The other teacher responded by suggesting I probably just wanted attention and that kids these days would claim anything for special treatment. It hurt, but I tried to ignore it. I thought if I kept my head down, it would eventually stop. But it didn't. It got worse. One day, after months of this treatment, I was struggling to focus in class. My anxiety was through the roof, and I kept thinking about how much easier it would be if my service dog was there. The teacher noticed my distraction and decided to make an example of me. She accused me of daydreaming again and said I was falling behind. Then she told me that at this rate I would amount to nothing in life. Something in me snapped. All the pain, all the fear, all the anger I'd been holding in came pouring out. I burst into tears and ran out of the classroom. That night, I finally told my parents everything. They were furious. My mom asked why I hadn't told them sooner. I explained that I didn't want to cause trouble and thought it would get better. My dad declared that this would end now and they wouldn't let the school get away with it. My parents contacted the Human Rights Tribunal, who agreed to take on our case. It turns out, a lot of my classmates had witnessed the bullying and were willing to testify. Their parents were shocked when they learned what had been going on. The lawsuit was intense. I had to relive a lot of painful moments, but knowing I was fighting for what was right gave me strength. And guess what? We won. The school was found guilty of discrimination and was ordered to pay a massive fine. They also had to implement new policies for students with disabilities and provide training for all staff. The teacher who had bullied me the most fired on the spot. But the best part? The school board decided to make an example of this case. They threatened to shut down the school if they didn't make serious changes. Suddenly, everyone was bending over backward to accommodate me and my service dog. On my first day back with my furry friend by my side, the principal personally welcomed us. He apologized for everything I'd been through and promised they would do better. Long story short, don't mess with a disabled kid. We're tougher than you think. When I graduated college with a degree in hospitality management, I had big dreams of running my own hotel someday, but the job market was tough. After months of searching, I landed an entry-level position at the park. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a foot in the door. Over the next few years, I worked my way up through various roles. I learned the ins and outs of park operations, from crowd control to ride maintenance. Eventually, I landed a supervisory position overseeing several areas of the park. It was a demanding job, but I loved the challenge. One of the perks of my role was that I didn't often have to deal directly with guests. Most of my work happened behind the scenes. But on this particular day in July, I found myself in the middle of the park during operating hours. Now, if you've ever been to Central Florida in the summer, you know it rains like clockwork every afternoon. This day was no exception. I was walking through the park, headed to inspect one of the attractions, when the skies opened up. We're talking a torrential downpour, the kind that soaks you to the bone in seconds. I ducked into the nearest building, which happened to be full of guests in colorful ponchos. They were all huddled together waiting out the storm. I tried to keep a low profile, hoping to avoid any guest interactions, but that's when she appeared. A woman, who I'll call Karen, approached me and demanded to know when the rain would stop. She complained that her children wanted to enjoy the enchanted carousel. I tried to explain that storms were common in the area, but she wasn't having it. Karen accused me of ruining her kids' vacation. When I asked for clarification, she ranted about saving for years to bring her family to Magic Kingdom, only to have it rain constantly. She even went so far as to blame me personally for the weather. I attempted to reason with her, explaining that we had no control over the weather. This only seemed to anger her more. Karen insisted that we must have some way to stop the rain if we wanted to, and accused us of being understaffed and unable to accommodate guests properly. I tried to reassure her that we wanted all our guests to have the best time possible, as their enjoyment was crucial for return visits. However, this seemed to push Karen over the edge. She got right in my face and started yelling at me. She demanded that I use my radio to call someone and make the rain stop, using some colorful language in the process. I felt my blood pressure rising. In all my years working here, I'd never encountered someone so entitled. I knew I had to keep my cool or I'd risk losing my job. Just then my radio beeped with a weather update. I stepped away to listen. When I returned, I decided to have a little fun. In my most sarcastic tone, I told Karen that I had just spoken to the clouds, and they said the rain would be gone by 4:35 p.m. To my utter shock, Karen's face softened, and she thanked me. I stood there, mouth agape, as she walked away. I couldn't believe what had just happened. Shaking my head, I went about my business, thinking the encounter was over. About an hour later, the rain had stopped, and the sun was beating down mercilessly. The humidity was oppressive. As I was making my final rounds, I spotted Karen making a beeline for me. I braced myself for another confrontation. To my surprise, Karen approached me and thanked me for calling someone to make the rain stop. When I expressed confusion, she reiterated her belief that we could control the weather. Still bewildered, I mumbled, "You're welcome." In response, I decided to have one last bit of fun. I called out to Karen, informing her that we'd be turning the sun down in about an hour and suggested she get her last few rides in before it got dark. Karen thanked me for being so helpful. She even promised to leave a great review about our supposed weather control abilities. I walked back to my work truck still laughing. It's moments like these that make even the toughest days at the happiest place on earth worth it. Who knows? Maybe tomorrow I'll learn how to control the tides or make the fireworks spell out custom messages. After all, anything's possible in a world where theme park employees can control the weather, right? I've been working as a lead hand in the back of this retail store for years. My job was to handle shipments, manage deliveries, and make sure the crew out back was doing their job right. I also worked on restocking for the front of the store. It wasn't dazzling, but I was good at it. My assistant manager was this older guy who wasn't great with computers, so I ended up doing a lot of his computer work too. When he resigned, I thought, this is my chance. I applied for the job feeling pretty confident. I mean, I was already doing half the work anyway. But life has a way of kicking you when you're down. Not only did I not get the job, but they brought in this guy from another store to be the new assistant manager. Let's call him Mr. Jerk. I'd worked with him before, and let me tell you, he was bad news. Once, he even threw me under the bus for one of his mistakes. I got yelled at in front of everyone and then written up by the store manager. It was humiliating. I was already thinking about quitting, but this was the last straw. I decided to leave, but not without a little payback. Now my colleague, let's call him the biker, he was this Harley-riding guy who went to a big motorcycle rally in Sturgis, South Dakota every August. I waited until right before his trip to submit my resignation. I was clever about it. I attached my resignation letter as a PDF to some reports and requested a read receipt. When Mr. Jerk opened it, I printed out the proof. He couldn't say he never got it. Here's where it gets interesting. In our store, we used this online scheduling app for the warehouse crew. The admin account was under the assistant manager's email. It was store policy. All emails were set up by job title, not name. When someone left, IT would change the password. I asked Mr. Jerk repeatedly for the new password to the scheduling site. He never gave it to me, so I couldn't update the schedule. The day before I left, I told my crew to make sure they checked the app for their hours. Then I went home and turned off my work phone. On what was supposed to be my first day gone, I showed up to return my phone and keys. Mr. Jerk was losing his mind. The store manager pulled us both into his office. Mr. Jerk started ranting about how unacceptable my behavior was. He complained that I was unreachable all weekend and that he had to come in and deal with all sorts of problems. He demanded that I be written up. The store manager asked for my side of the story. I questioned whether a write-up could be given to someone who wasn't an employee. When the store manager confirmed that write-ups were indeed for employees, I pointed out that it would be hard to write me up since I was no longer employed there. I then pulled out my resignation letter and showed it to them. Mr. Jerk denied ever receiving it, but I countered by showing him the email and read receipt from 3 weeks ago. The store manager asked Mr. Jerk about my replacement and if he had been interviewing anyone. Mr. Jerk, caught off guard, accused me of faking the email and admitted he hadn't been interviewing anyone. He suggested that the biker could cover until he filled the position. I informed them that the biker was at the motorcycle rally I had mentioned earlier. I also offered to have IT verify the email's authenticity if they doubted it. Mr. Jerk visibly paled as he realized he had no supervisors for the dock at all. The store manager, seeming desperate, asked if there was any way they could convince me to stay. I apologized and explained that I had already lined up a new job. Then I warned them that they had even bigger problems to deal with. I showed them more emails where I'd repeatedly asked Mr. Jerk for the scheduling app password. Then I logged into the app on the store manager's computer and pointed out that the schedule for the warehouse crew for the next 2 weeks was completely blank, with nobody scheduled to work at all. As I handed over my keys and phone, I casually mentioned that I had factory reset the phone as per IT's instructions. I wished them luck and left. As I walked out, I could hear the store manager yelling at Mr. Jerk. Apparently, he had to scramble to call in workers at the last minute, which meant paying overtime. Many of the contact details were outdated, so he had to ask around for current numbers. In the end, Mr. Jerk got fired for cause, which meant no unemployment benefits, and he was marked as do not rehire. They had to bring in people from other stores to cover. I'd like to say I felt bad, but after how he treated me, nah. Sometimes you reap what you sow.